After learning about the monetary and banking system, in this session we will understand more about an important function of a bank. That is, how the bank creates deposit through lending activities. Very often, bank deposits are included in the money supply, and thus, when there is an increase or decrease in the bank's deposit, the money supply in an economy will also be affected. Apart from taking deposits from the general public, in fact, banks can also create new deposits through lending out existing deposits, thereby increasing the money supply in the banking system. Now we will learn how banks can achieve maximized deposit creation. Before explaining this mechanism, let's learn about a few related assumptions. First, we will assume a fractional reserve banking system. A fractional reserve system means that banks are only required to retain a portion of the deposit as reserves to cope with the daily withdrawals of depositors. Thus, banks can lend out part of their deposits as loans. For example, assume that the legal reserve ratio is 20%. If you deposit $1,000 into the bank only needs to retain 20% of your deposit, that is $200 as reserves. The bank can then lend out the remaining as loans. Second, we will assume banks would not hold excess reserve. This means that banks would only retain the minimum amount of deposit as the required reserve. Banks will not put even an extra dollar in their safe. The third assumption of maximum deposit creation is that there is a sufficient demand for loans by the general public. This assumption can ensure that banks can lend out all excess reserve. If the demand for bank loans by the general public is not adequate, banks would not be able to lend out all excess reserve and are forced to hold excess reserve. In this case, the deposit creation would not be at the maximum. Finally, in order to allow the banking system to create the maximum amount of deposit, we also need to assume that there is no cash leakage in the banking system. This means that all loans lent out by banks will be eventually deposited back into the banking system. After understanding these four assumptions, let us see how banks create deposit. If you deposit $1,000 into Bank A, the cash assets held by Bank A, i.e. the reserve, will immediately increase by $1,000. In the meantime, the deposit in the bank, which is a liability, will also increase by $1,000. It is because when you deposit $1,000 into the bank, it means the bank owes you $1,000. We can use a balance sheet to illustrate the assets in the form of reserve and liabilities in the form of deposits of the bank. Now there is a deposit of $1,000 in the banking system. Assuming that under the fractional reserve system, the legal minimum reserve ratio is 20%. Therefore, Bank A only needs to retain $200 as reserve for the deposit of $1,000. The remaining $800 can be fully lent out. We can use a formula to explain the relationship between deposit, legal reserve ratio, and reserve. Legal reserve, minimum amount of reserve, equals deposit times legal reserve ratio. As the bank has a $1,000 reserve now, and it only requires to keep $200, the remaining $800 is called the excess reserve. Excess reserve equals actual reserve minus legal reserve. Previously, we have assumed that banks will lend out all excess reserve. Therefore, it will lend out a loan of $800 as shown on the balance sheet. This is the first step in the credit creation process. Under the assumption of no cash leakage, the loan of $800 lent out by Bank A will go back into the banking system. In other words, we assume after a borrower has taken $800 from Bank A, she will spend all the money for consumption. The seller, who receives the money, will deposit the full amount of $800 back into Bank B. As a result, the reserve and deposit of Bank B will increase by $800 accordingly. Same as the previous situation, under the fractional reserve system, Bank B only needs to keep 20% of the $800, i.e. $160 as reserve, and the remaining $640 would be lent out. After the borrower obtains $640, the same amount will be deposited back into Bank C. This process will go on and on. In this process, we can see that the total amount of deposit in the banking system will accumulate. This process will go on until there is no more excess reserve in the banking system. Through this formula, maximum amount of deposit equals reserve times 1 divided by legal reserve ratio, we can calculate the maximum amount of deposit that can be created. The factor 1 divided by legal reserve ratio, which can be called the maximum banking multiplier, is used to calculate how much deposit a banking system can create. For instance, in this example, maximum banking multiplier equals 1 divided by legal reserve ratio. A $1,000 deposit in this banking system can be used to create a $5,000 deposit, and thus the maximum banking multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 20%, or 5 times. Through these lending activities, the banking system will create more deposits by the initial cash that you put in. This is called deposit creation of the banking system. In the above example, deposit creation also increases the money supply of the economy. It is because when the public deposits $1,000 into Bank A, the cash held by the public will decrease by $1,000. After the deposit creation, the total amount of deposit will increase by $5,000 eventually. Therefore, the total money supply will increase by $4,000 in total. Changes of money supply equal changes on cash held by public plus changes on deposit. Finally, please note that deposit creation will occur when there is new deposit or the central bank lowers the legal reserve ratio. After learning about the deposit creation, let's shift our focus to deposit contraction in the next video.